Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. This week, I want to continue on my quest of trying to classify what the R35 GTR actually is. For those of you that are new to the channel, I have done some videos where I try to determine whether or not the R35 qualifies as a Skyline. I also tried to figure out if the GTR may be considered an exotic. Now, if you haven't seen those videos and you'd like to, I'm gonna go ahead and post some banners above my head, as well as put the links to the videos in the description down below. So if you'd like to, you can check out those videos. This week, I want to try and figure out if the R35 GTR is actually a supercar. Now, this question comes from one of the viewers who posted in the comment section, and I thought it was a good question. Although before I could answer that question, I first had to figure out what exactly qualifies as a supercar. Now, when you initially think of a supercar, initially you immediately go to really fast cars like Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Koenigseggs, stuff like that. But when you think about it, it used to be that some of those 60s muscle cars were considered supercars. So did the definition change, or are there certain elements that need to be met for a car to be considered a supercar? Well, I didn't know what those elements were, so I turned to the authority that is the authority on everything, Google. And I checked out a number of automotive journalists who actually talked about this subject. Now, these different journalists, they seem to agree mostly on what the elements were that took a car to the supercar status. There were a few elements where they didn't agree, so I'm going to ignore those. Let's just talk about the elements that seems like almost every automotive journalist seems to agree qualifies a car as a supercar. The first qualification I want to talk about when it comes to determining whether or not the R35 GTR is considered a supercar is probably the first element you thought of when you heard the term supercar, and that is the car has to be fast. Now, when you take a look at the history of the word supercar, it is definitely connected directly to speed. It seems like the term supercar was really coined or at least rose to predominance in the 60s. At that point in time, some of these American muscle cars were starting to put down some seriously good times in the quarter mile, and the term supercar started to get thrown around to describe these cars. In fact, the term was starting to be used so much that some of the manufacturers of these American muscle cars started to use it in their marketing of the cars to the general public. So in that seems like the supercar was directly connected to speed. Now, since then, it seems like the term has kind of branched away from American muscle, where now you could either have a car that's an American muscle car, or you could have a supercar. Even though a lot of these American muscle cars would technically qualify as a supercar, it seems like they're their own separate distinction now. So the question is, what is a supercar by today's standard? It seems like automotive journalists use the term supercar as almost part of a tier system, where you have, your standard everyday commuters, and then above that you would have a sports car. Above that you're going to have your supercar, and then you even have a tier above that, which is the hypercars. So what really differentiates these tiers? Well, of course you have your standard commuter cars, and any car that's going to be faster, more nimble, more agile, and more fun to drive is going to probably classify as a sports car. Now, when you think of sports cars, you're probably going to be thinking about things like the Miata, any import tuner car, or possibly even a Porsche. Those seem to fall into the sports car classification. Now, how do you bust from a sports car into a supercar? Well, it seems like these journalists have actually created a specific line that you have to cross to be considered a supercar, and that is your top end speed. The top end speed of a car has to be more than 186.4 miles per hour or 300 kilometers per hour. Now, I know that might seem like a bit of a random bar to set for a car to pass. However, they had a specific reason for picking that speed. And that speed is because that is about how fast a typical Formula One car goes. So if you have a car that has a higher top end speed than a Formula One car, you have a supercar. Now, of course, the way you break into the hypercar level is if you have a car that's just so blisteringly fast that no sane person would want to drive it on a public street, you have a hypercar. So pretty much then, if you have a car that's between the speed of a Formula One car and a car that's just stupidly fast, you're in the supercar territory. So then the question is, does the R35 count as a supercar? And that answer is going to be yes. For those of you that know, this car is ridiculously fast. I mean, it has a 0 to 60 speed of 2.9 seconds. And it has a top end speed of over 200 miles per hour. So in that, the R35 GTR definitely qualifies as a supercar. The next qualification I want to talk about in determining whether or not the R35 is a supercar is one that automotive journalists seem to agree is an element, but is not necessarily that important of an element, and that is who is the manufacturer of the car. Now, when you take a look at Nissan isn't exactly known as a supercar manufacturer. I mean, when you take a look at their line, you know, they've got the Sentra, they've got the Rogue, they've got the upcoming 400Z. Now, of course, I believe the 400Z is going to be a great sports car, but I doubt it's going to qualify as a supercar. So in that, it would seem that Nissan really isn't a supercar manufacturer, especially when you take a look at other more notable supercar manufacturers like Ferrari, Lamborghini, Koenigsegg. Those manufacturers have set themselves up as supercar and really, let's be honest, hypercar manufacturers. So in that, it would seem like the R35 GTR might not be as much of a supercar because it's simply made by Nissan. However, let's compare that with another qualification that the journalist seems to agree isn't necessarily a requirement, but it does definitely go to kind of help the argument that a car would be a supercar, and that is it has to have low production numbers and high cost. Now, in that, the R35 would definitely qualify. Now, this car is extremely limited in its production because the engine is made by only one of 4 guys in Japan, which means they can only make a certain amount of these cars per month, which goes to show that it has very limited production numbers. Now, as far as the cost, I believe it qualifies as well because when we take a look at these cars, brand new, they go for over $120,000. Now, when you take a look at some of the specialty packages like the Nismo, then you're up over $220,000. So in that, it would seem that this would be a factor that would seem to support the idea that the GTR is a supercar. So when you take a look at the 2 elements I talked about, which is the manufacturer, which would seem to suggest that the GTR is not a supercar, but compare it with the qualification that it has low production numbers and high cost, those 2 elements would seem to cancel each other out. However, like I said, either way, it's not even that big of a deal because according to these automotive journalists, those factors aren't exactly dispositive in determining whether or not the GTR would be a supercar. The next thing I want to talk about is something that actually wasn't on the list of qualifications for a car to become a supercar, and that is the looks. Apparently, it doesn't matter what the car looks like to be considered a supercar. Now, this is interesting because up till this point, it seemed like everything I discussed in this video kind of parallels what I was discussing in my video about whether or not the GTR would be considered an exotic. However, one of the things that was a qualification for a car to be an exotic was it had to have wild looks. However, here with the supercar, it doesn't. It doesn't matter what the car looks like. It doesn't have to look wild and crazy or extreme to be considered a supercar. In fact, it doesn't even factor at all. So in that, it's kind of interesting because originally it kind of seems like I was given the same elements that would be used to determine whether or not it's an exotic. So here we're starting to see that there's a separation between exotics and supercars, which means even though the GTR didn't qualify as an exotic, it's starting to look like it qualifies as a supercar. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to supercars is something that's very unique to the supercar title. And that is, over time, a car can actually lose its supercar status. Now, this is unique from some other differentiations when you take a look at something like an exotic car. An exotic car will always be considered an exotic car. If you see a 1990s Ferrari Testarossa or you see an old 80s Lamborghini Countach, you're still going to think of that car as an exotic car. However, cars back in the day that were considered supercars aren't necessarily considered supercars today. And it kind of makes sense. If you think back to when I was talking about how the term supercar was originally coined for 1960s muscle cars that were putting down decent times at the drag strip, none of us really consider those cars supercars anymore. I mean, how many times have you seen like a 67 fastback Mustang and thought, hey look, a supercar? More than likely you thought, oh look, old school American muscle or a classic car. So in that, it's interesting because a car classified as a supercar today may not be a supercar tomorrow. Now, with that being said, taking a look at what I've talked about in this video, I do believe that the R35 GTR does classify as a supercar. However, that is according to today's standards. As those sports cars that come out get faster, more nimble, more agile, and more fun to drive, as the GTR gets older, it may fall out of being a supercar. And this is even more apparent when you take a look at the fact that the R35 GTR really hasn't changed much since 2009, which means that as the GTR has been in production, there has already been advances to those cars that it was competing with as a supercar. Originally, the R35 GTR was put out to compete with the Porsche 911 GT3 RS, and it did that. And that's possibly what really, in my opinion, put it into that supercar status. However, since the time of 2009, where we're now in 2021, the GT3 RS has made improvements to its suspension, to its engine, to its handling, to its fuel management, to the point that the R35 GTR doesn't keep up with that car anymore. So that's just going to prove that even though I still think right now the R35 GTR considers itself a supercar, in the near future, it may fall out of that status. And there it is. We finally have a classification for the R35 GTR. For those of you that have been following the channel for a while, you know this is something I've been working on. I mean, first I tried to determine, is the R35 GTR Skyline? No, it's not. Then I tried to determine, would it qualify as an exotic? And the answer to that was nope. Finally though, we have a classification I believe the R35 fits in, and that is, it is a supercar. However, as I did discuss, over time it could lose its supercar status, and then we're gonna have to reclassify it all over again, but we'll worry about that when we get there. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go and hit that thumbs up button to let me know. It does help the channel out a lot. If you want to see more automotive, particularly GTR content in the future, go and subscribe to my channel. You can now follow me on all forms of social media, which include Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and I now have an active TikTok page, and there's links to all of those in the description down below. If you'd like to support the channel, I have now opened up the JD Archer shop. If you go to jdarcher.bigcartel.com, you'll see a limited selection of hats, t-shirts, and hoodies I've designed, and there's more designs on the way. I have also become an Amazon affiliate. If you go back to some of my previous videos where I show you how to work on cars, if you go to the description, I have a list of every tool and every part I use for that job. And so if that's something you need to do to your car, you just take a look through that list, make sure you have everything you need before you get started. And if you're missing a part or tool, just go ahead and click on that link and it'll take you exactly where you need to go to get what you need. If you have any questions or any comments on whether or not you feel the R35 GTR is a supercar, go ahead and post in the comments section down below. I will respond to you. I thank you all for watching, and until next time, forget everything else, focus on the finish line.